While filling her cavities, my 8-year-old patient asked, "Do grown-ups at your house play the statue game too?" I smiled. I haven't heard of that one. Her words slurred from the laughing gas. It's when we hear Daddy's car and everyone freezes like statues. My hygienist Sierra raised an eyebrow. That sounds interesting. How do you play? When we hear the garage, Mommy says statue time, and we all freeze wherever we are. Isabella explained drowsily. Even if I'm eating or playing, everything stops. That's when I noticed the faint yellow marks on her upper arm, mostly hidden by her sleeve. Sometimes I'm really good at it. Last week I held my spoon in the air for 20 whole minutes. She seemed proud. Mommy said I was the best statue ever. 20 minutes is a long time, I said, gently adjusting her sleeve to see better. Fingerprint bruises. Old ones. Can you raise your arm for me, sweetie? I need to adjust the chair. As she raised both arms, her shirt rode up. Linear marks crossed her lower back, some scarred, some fresh. What happens if someone moves during statue time? I kept working, acting like I was just doing my job. That's losing. Daddy doesn't like when we lose. I excused myself to get a different tool, stepping to my computer to pull up our mandatory reporting protocols. When I returned, I asked casually, "And if you win the statue game?" If we're all good statues, Daddy walks through and goes to his room. Then we can breathe normal again. Sometimes he even says good job, and we get to eat dinner. You get to eat dinner? Only if we win. Losers don't deserve dinner. But Mommy sneaks me crackers later. I made a show of checking Isabella's chart while secretly measuring the bruise patterns with my pen light. 3.2 centimeter spread on the grip marks. Adult male hand size. Isabella, what other games does your family play? I asked, motioning my hygienist to discreetly check on the father. The listening game, where he asks questions and we have to answer exactly right. I pulled out my light. Open wide again. What kind of questions? Like, who's the most important person in this house? The answer is always Daddy. The light revealed slight scarring on her inner cheek, likely from biting during stress. What happens when someone gets the answer wrong? Sometimes no breakfast, or lunch. My tummy hurts so bad, but crying makes it worse. My least favorite one is the quiet room. I set down my tools. Tell me about this quiet room while I set up this x-ray. I positioned the lead apron, noting how she winced when I touched her shoulders. It's the closet under the stairs. No light. We stay until we're sorry enough. I count to know how long I lasted. My record is 10,000 seconds. What's yours? The excitement in her voice broke my heart. That was over 2.5 hours. That's a lot of counting. Sierra returned, mouthing, "Her dad's asking how much longer you'll be." Mommy went in there last week, Isabella continued. She had to fold up real small 'cause she's bigger. Daddy said she forgot who pays the bills. Sometimes I hear her crying in there, but I can't help or I go in too. We learned that rule the hard way. I took the x-rays, handed her some stickers and said, "I need to develop these. Sierra will stay with you." In the hallway, I called CPS from my cell. Active abuse case. Child has physical marks. Describes systematic torture disguised as games. Father is in waiting room. Returning, I pretended to review her chart. Isabella, has anyone else seen you play these games? No, silly. It's a family secret. Daddy says other people wouldn't understand our special rules. I gently examined her neck, finding more old bruises hidden by her hair. Does your teacher know about the statue game? No, we're really good at keeping secrets. Paul's getting good too. He hasn't cried in the quiet room for 3 weeks. He's only 6. The neighbors called the police once about the screaming. Now he just hits his head against the wall, but real soft so nobody hears. I heard footsteps. Her father appeared in the doorway. How much longer? Just finishing up, I said calmly, my body blocking his view of Isabella. Maybe 10 more minutes. He grunted and left. I turned back to Isabella, who was now completely rigid with a faraway look in her eye. I almost moved when he came in. I almost lost. I finished quickly as 2 officers arrived through our back entrance. Sierra had called them while I was documenting. You did amazing today, Isabella, I said, removing her bib. The best patient ever. Better than being a statue? So much better. I stepped into the hall where the officers waited with a CPS worker. I told her everything. The bruises, mouth scarring, games, the brother. Through the door window, I watched Isabella swinging her feet, finally relaxed. She didn't know it yet, but soon she'd never have to play statue again. Jasmine Matthews pushed past me into the treatment room and knelt down next to Isabella's chair, her badge clipped to her belt catching the fluorescent light. Isabella's eyes tracked from the badge to Jasmine's face, then back to me, her legs still swinging but slower now. Jasmine smiled and told Isabella she worked with kids and families, that she had a really cool playroom at her office with toys and art supplies. Isabella asked if there were crayons because she loved purple ones the best. Sierra's fingers suddenly dug into my arm and she pulled me toward the doorway, whispering that Isabella's father had just stood up from his chair in the waiting room and was pacing back and forth near the reception desk. Through the small window in the door, I could see him checking his watch every few seconds, his jaw clenched tight. Detective Suarez must have noticed our body language because he moved casually from his position near the back entrance to stand between the treatment area and the lobby, his hand resting on his hip near his radio. Jasmine was asking Isabella if she'd like to come see the playroom while the grown-ups talked about boring paperwork stuff that kids didn't need to worry about. Isabella nodded, still drowsy from the sedation, and started to slide off the dental chair. I reached out to steady her, my hands shaking as I helped her feet find the floor. She wobbled slightly and grabbed my scrub pants for balance. Sierra handed Isabella her backpack while Jasmine stood up and held out her hand. Isabella took it without hesitation, probably because Jasmine had that same calm energy good teachers have. We started walking toward the back exit, Isabella between Jasmine and me, when the shouting erupted from the lobby. Her father's voice boomed through the clinic demanding to know where his daughter was, why she wasn't done yet, that he had places to be. Isabella froze instantly, that same rigid posture I'd seen earlier when he appeared in the doorway. Detective Suarez and his partner moved fast, their footsteps heavy as they headed toward the lobby while Jasmine scooped Isabella up and hurried toward the back door. I held it open as we rushed into the parking lot, Isabella's arms tight around Jasmine's neck. Through the back window of the clinic, I watched the two officers trying to calm Isabella's father down, but he was pushing against them, his face red and twisted with rage. His partner had his hands up in a calming gesture while Detective Suarez stood firm, blocking the hallway. Isabella turned her head at the noise and asked why Daddy sounded so mad. Jasmine shifted Isabella to her hip and said sometimes grown-ups needed timeouts too when they got too upset, just like kids did. Isabella nodded like this made perfect sense, which made my stomach turn because it probably did in her world. Jasmine's car had a booster seat already installed in the back, and she buckled Isabella in while I stood there feeling useless, watching the clinic door for any sign the father might break free. Isabella waved at me through the window as they pulled away, and I waved back, trying to smile even though my face felt frozen. Back inside, I walked straight to my office and closed the door, pulling out a legal pad and starting to write down everything Isabella had said during the appointment. My hand cramped from gripping the pen so hard, but I needed every detail documented perfectly. The statue game with the 20-minute spoon hold, the quiet room where she counted to 10,000, the listening game with its trick questions, Paul hitting his head softly against the wall so the neighbors wouldn't hear. I wrote about the bruise measurements, the 2 centimeter spread that matched an adult male grip, the linear marks on her back, the scarring in her mouth from stress biting. Sierra knocked and came in without waiting for an answer, setting a cup of coffee on my desk. She sat in the patient chair across from me and watched me write for a few minutes before pulling out her phone. She showed me the screen where a voice recording app displayed a timeline of our entire appointment with Isabella. She'd started recording the moment Isabella mentioned the statue game, capturing everything on her phone that she'd kept in her scrub pocket. We both knew recording a patient without consent could get us in serious trouble, but neither of us cared about that right now. The evidence was more important than any professional consequences we might face. Detective Suarez came back about 2 hours later, his tie loosened and his face tired. He said they'd booked the father on charges of resisting arrest and disturbing the peace for now, but those were just to hold him while they built the abuse case. He needed copies of everything I had, including my notes, the x-rays showing Isabella's teeth, and inadvertently capturing images of her facial structure, and the photos I'd taken of the bruises under the pretense of documenting her dental condition. He mentioned that another CPS worker was picking up Paul from his elementary school right at that moment, that they'd coordinated the timing so both children would be safe before the father could potentially make bail. I handed him everything I'd prepared, including Sierra's phone with the recording, though he said he'd have to check with the prosecutor about whether that could be used. That evening I sat at my kitchen table staring at the plate of pasta my partner had made, but I couldn't make myself eat it. Every time I tried to take a bite, I kept thinking about Isabella counting to 10,000 in that dark closet, about her mother folded up small in the same space, about 6-year-old Paul learning not to cry anymore. My partner found me 20 minutes later sitting on the bathroom floor sobbing into a towel I'd pressed against my face to muffle the sound. They didn't say anything, just sat down next to me and pulled me against their chest, rubbing my back while I cried about children who thought torture was just a game their family played. I couldn't sleep that night, jumping at every car that drove past our house, convinced each one was Isabella's father coming to find me. The arrest records were public, and it wouldn't take much to figure out which dental clinic had called CPS that day. By 3 in the morning, I gave up trying to sleep and opened my laptop to research what happened next in CPS cases, reading about emergency custody hearings and foster placement protocols and criminal prosecution timelines, until my eyes burned from staring at the screen. The sun was coming up when my phone rang, and Katarzina's name showed on the screen. She wanted me at the clinic early to talk about security before we opened. I drove there on autopilot, my eyes heavy from no sleep. The parking lot was empty except for her car. She had coffee waiting in her office and pushed a cup into my hands before sitting down. She'd already called a security company, and they were sending someone to watch our lobby starting today. She showed me the new panic buttons she'd ordered for every treatment room. We went over evacuation routes, and she gave me a key card for the back entrance that only senior staff would have. The security guard arrived while we were talking, a big guy named Arjun who used to be a cop. Katarzina walked him through the clinic layout while I tried to act normal for our first patients. Around noon, Detective Suarez called my cell. He needed me at the station for my formal statement that afternoon at 2. He mentioned they'd searched the family's house and found some things but couldn't tell me what yet. I told Sierra I had a family emergency and left early. The police station smelled like old coffee and floor cleaner. Detective Suarez met me in the lobby and led me to a small room with a camera mounted in the corner. For 3 hours, I went through everything Isabella had said, every bruise I'd seen, every detail I could remember. He asked the same questions different ways, making sure my story stayed the same. Then he opened a folder and showed me photos from the house. The closet under the stairs was tiny, maybe 3 feet by 4 feet. There were scratch marks on the inside of the door, a child's fingernail marks. One photo showed the kitchen timer Isabella had mentioned, still sitting on the counter. Another showed stress position marks on the living room wall where small hands had been placed. I had to look away. He asked me to draw diagrams of where I'd seen bruises on Isabella's body. My hand shook as I sketched her arms, her back, marking each injury I'd documented. When I finally left the station, the sun was setting. I sat in my car for 10 minutes before I felt steady enough to drive. My phone rang as I pulled into my driveway. It was Jasmine Matthews. Both kids were safe in emergency foster care, placed together with an experienced family. They'd had their forensic interviews that day. Paul had confirmed everything Isabella said and told them worse things. Things about being made to stand on one foot for hours, about having to eat food off the floor when he spilled, about their dad making them fight each other for his entertainment. Isabella had drawn pictures during her interview showing the quiet room, the statue game, their dad's angry face. The forensic interviewer said both children were remarkably matter-of-fact about the abuse, like they were describing normal family life. I thanked Jasmine for calling and went inside. My partner had dinner ready, but I couldn't eat. I kept seeing those scratch marks inside the closet door. The next morning I went back to work, trying to pretend everything was normal. Arjun nodded at me from his spot near the front desk. My first patient's dad got loud about our insurance policy not covering his kids' sealants. His voice rose, and suddenly I was back in that treatment room with Isabella's father looming in the doorway. My whole body went rigid. Sierra smoothly stepped between us and took over the conversation while I escaped to the bathroom. I splashed cold water on my face and stared at myself in the mirror. 3 days after Isabella's disclosure, I was scrolling through my phone during lunch when I saw it. Local news had posted a story about a father arrested for child abuse. No names were mentioned, but it said the abuse was discovered during a routine medical appointment. The comment section was already filling up with people guessing which clinic, which doctor. That afternoon, we had 4 cancellations. Patients who'd been coming to us for years suddenly had scheduling conflicts. I wondered if they'd figured out it started here, or if they just didn't want to risk being associated with the story. While I was dealing with the fallout at the clinic, Marina sat alone in her empty house. The silence felt wrong without the kids. She stared at the kitchen timer that had controlled their lives for so long. Part of her wanted to throw it against the wall and watch it shatter, but she couldn't move. He might come back. He might notice it was gone. Even with him in jail, she couldn't break his rules. She picked it up with shaking hands and set it back exactly where it belonged. A week later, I met with the prosecutor assigned to the case. Juan Guyan was younger than I expected, but her handshake was firm and her eyes were sharp. She walked me through what would happen if the case went to trial. The defense attorney would try to make me look bad. He'd question my training, my experience, suggest I'd misunderstood what Isabella said. She had me practice saying, "That's not accurate," and I documented exactly what I observed over and over. We spent 2 hours going through potential questions. Meanwhile, Marina finally found the courage to dial the number the police had given her. The woman who answered was kind and didn't push when Marina could barely whisper that she needed help. They had a bed available. Marina could come whenever she was ready. She hung up and stared at the phone for another hour before calling back to say yes. The next day, Detective Suarez called me back to the station. This time, he had medical records from the children's physical exams. He spread them across the table like evidence in a crime scene. X-rays showing healed fractures in Paul's ribs. Photos of old burn scars on Isabella's legs that looked like cigarette marks. A map of injuries going back years. Some were healing, some were fresh. All of them told a story of escalating violence. I made it to the bathroom just in time to throw up. Detective Suarez waited outside and handed me a bottle of water when I came out. He'd seen this before, but it never got easier. 2 days later, Marina sat in the courthouse hallway, waiting for the emergency custody hearing, and when the bailiff brought him through in handcuffs, she froze like she was playing statue game all over again. Her whole body went rigid, and her legal aid lawyer put a hand on her shoulder to steady her. The handcuffs made a metal sound when he walked past, and Marina stared at the floor counting tiles the way Isabella counted seconds in the closet. The lawyer was young and wore a suit that looked too big, but she squeezed Marina's shoulder and told her she was doing great. Marina watched him disappear into the courtroom and felt something between terror that he'd get out and relief that someone finally stopped him. Back at the clinic that same morning, I found a voicemail on our answering machine from a blocked number saying we should mind our own business if we knew what was good for us. The voice was low and angry, and I played it 3 times trying to figure out if it was him or someone else. Katarzyna came in early and listened to it once before calling the police to report it. She spent the rest of the morning on the phone with a security company arranging for new locks and cameras at every entrance. We got panic buttons installed under the reception desk and in each treatment room. The security guy showed us how to use them and said the police would be here in under 4 minutes if we pressed one. That afternoon, Marina sat with an intake worker at the women's shelter trying to explain how the games started. She told the woman how at first she just wanted to keep him calm after bad days at work. The statue game started as a way to give him space to cool down when he got home angry. Then it became a rule, and then the rule became everything. The intake worker didn't look shocked or disgusted like Marina expected. She just nodded and said she'd heard similar stories from other women. She said the games always start small and grow into something else. Marina cried when the woman said it wasn't her fault, even though she enforced the rules. The next day, I sat at my desk with Isabella's dental records spread out, creating detailed diagrams for the prosecutor. I used my medical training to mark each bruise and scar with dates based on the healing patterns. The grip marks on her arm were about 3 weeks old based on the yellow coloring. The scars on her back went back months or maybe years. Each mark told its own story about when things got bad and when they got worse. I measured everything with a ruler and wrote down the exact size and location of every injury. Meanwhile, Marina met with Jasmine Matthews, who had more questions about the games. Marina's hands shook as she admitted she made the children stand in stress positions when he wasn't home. She showed Jasmine how she made them hold their arms straight out for 10 minutes if they talked back. She demonstrated the wall sit position they had to hold if they didn't clean their rooms fast enough. The shame felt like drowning, and Marina had to stop talking several times to catch her breath. Jasmine wrote everything down without judgment, and reminded Marina that she was a victim too. The next morning, Detective Suarez called me back to the station with new information. He spread out photocopies of a journal they found hidden in the father's home office. The pages were covered in neat handwriting, documenting every punishment like a science experiment. He wrote down the date and time and what the child did wrong and exactly how long they stayed in the closet. He rated their crying on a scale of 1 to 10 and made notes about which punishments worked best. One entry described making Paul stand on 1 foot for an hour because he spilled juice. Another detailed putting Isabella in the closet for 4 hours because she laughed too loud. The level of planning made me run to the bathroom to throw up again. Detective Suarez waited outside and said this was the most organized abuse he'd seen in 20 years. Later that day, Marina sat with Jasmine learning about the case plan for getting her kids back. There would be parenting classes twice a week, and individual therapy and group therapy and supervised visits at first. Marina would have to complete a psychological evaluation and submit to random home visits and drug tests, even though she'd never used drugs. The list seemed impossible, but Jasmine said hundreds of parents completed these programs every year. She said if Marina did everything right, she could have unsupervised visits in 6 months and maybe get them back in a year. Marina wrote down every requirement and promised to start immediately. 3 days later, Detective Suarez called with bad news that made my stomach drop. The father had made bail with an ankle monitor and a no-contact order for Marina and the kids. The judge set bail at $50,000, and his brother paid it that morning. He had to stay 500 feet away from the family and check in with a probation officer every week. I started checking my rearview mirror constantly on the drive home and took different routes every day. I parked in different spots at the clinic and made Sierra walk me to my car after dark. That night, Marina was washing dishes at the shelter when her phone rang from a blocked number. She answered and heard breathing on the other end for 30 seconds before the line went dead. She knew it was him, even though he didn't say anything. She saved the call log and wrote down the exact time in a notebook the shelter gave her for documenting violations. The breathing sounded angry, and she knew he'd call again. The next week, Juan Guyan met with me to practice for trial testimony in case he didn't take a plea deal. She warned me his lawyer Logan Hood would try to make me look bad on the stand. We spent 3 hours practicing with her playing the defense attorney, asking trick questions. She taught me to pause before answering and to say that's not accurate when he twisted my words. She made me practice saying it over and over until it sounded natural. Marina told me later that she spent those same days filling out job applications at the library computer, her hands shaking as she typed. She couldn't list her husband as a reference and had no work history for 8 years. The gap looked suspicious on every application. She walked into grocery stores and fast food places with printed resumes, watching managers glance at the blank employment section and shake their heads. One manager at Target actually asked what she'd been doing all those years. Marina just said taking care of family and watched his face close off. She applied to 23 places that first week. The shelter helped her practice interview answers, but she kept stumbling when they asked about her availability. She couldn't explain she needed flexible hours for court dates and therapy and supervised visits she didn't have yet. Finally, a grocery store manager named Carlos looked at her application and said they needed someone for overnight stocking. He didn't ask about the gap. Marina started that Sunday working 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., learning to stack cans and rotate milk while everyone else slept. Back at the clinic, one of our hygienists named Rachel came into my office crying. She said she couldn't stop thinking about Isabella in that closet. She kept having nightmares about kids trapped in small spaces. She handed me her resignation letter and apologized for leaving us short-staffed. Katarzyna and I split Rachel's patients between us while posting the job opening. We interviewed 5 candidates but kept comparing them to Rachel. The stress was getting to everyone. Even our receptionist started double-checking the locks at closing time. 3 weeks passed before Marina's first supervised visit. She sat in the CPS waiting room for 40 minutes before Jasmine brought the kids in. Paul wouldn't look at her. He stared at his shoes while Isabella ran to Marina asking when they could go home. Marina hugged them both, but Paul stayed stiff in her arms. The supervisor sat in the corner taking notes on a yellow pad. Every word Marina said got written down. Isabella kept asking about her toys and her room and when Daddy was coming back. Marina tried to explain they were staying somewhere else for a while, but Isabella didn't understand. Paul finally spoke to ask if this was Marina's fault. The supervisor wrote faster. Marina said no, Daddy made bad choices, but Paul turned away. When the hour ended, Isabella cried and Paul walked out without saying goodbye. Marina sat in her car afterwards sobbing for 20 minutes before driving back to the shelter. That same week, someone posted on a local Facebook group about a father arrested for child abuse at a dental office. They didn't name our clinic but included enough details that people figured it out. The post got shared 200 times. We started getting phone calls. Some people thanked us for saving those kids. Others accused us of destroying a family over nothing. Someone left a dead rat on our doorstep with a note calling us snitches. Katarzyna installed security cameras and started walking us to our cars. The mail got weird too. Thank you cards mixed with threats. One woman sent a 10-page letter about how CPS stole her kids 20 years ago, and we were part of the conspiracy. During Marina's next therapy session, she finally told Jasmine the whole truth. She admitted she made Isabella stand in the corner for 3 hours when she talked back. She described holding Paul's arms behind his back until he stopped crying. She explained how she enforced every rule when her husband wasn't home, because she was terrified of what he'd do if the kids misbehaved. Jasmine just kept taking notes without any expression. Marina waited for judgment, but Jasmine only asked what Marina understood now about those actions. Marina said she knew it was abuse and she participated and she was sorry, but sorry didn't fix anything. 2 days later, I was cleaning a patient's teeth when a car backfired in the parking lot. I jumped and dropped my instruments on the floor. The patient, an older man, asked if I was okay. I made up something about drinking too much coffee that morning. My hands shook as I picked up the tools. Sierra noticed and took over while I went to wash my face in the bathroom. I kept seeing the father in the doorway of the exam room. Every male voice in the waiting room made me tense up. I started parking in different spots and checking my mirrors constantly. The hypervigilance was exhausting, but I couldn't stop. Marina's lawyer filed for a restraining order at the next court date. The judge reviewed the evidence and granted it immediately. Marina could finally sleep without jumping at every sound. She told me she slept 10 hours straight that first night at the shelter. No footsteps in the hallway, no door slamming, no yelling, just quiet and safety. She woke up confused about where she was, then remembered and cried from relief. 3 days later, I was finishing paperwork when I saw a familiar car creeping past our clinic. The father was driving slowly, looking at our windows. I called 911 immediately and gave them the license plate. The dispatcher knew about the protection order and sent units right away. They caught him 2 blocks away. He was arrested for violating the order and his bail got revoked. Marina spent the next week writing letters to both kids. Her therapist helped her revise them 7 times to get the wording right. She couldn't make excuses but needed to apologize. She couldn't promise things would go back to normal, but wanted them to know she loved them. The letters sat in sealed envelopes that CPS would decide when to deliver. The preliminary hearing arrived 6 weeks after the arrest. I wore my most professional outfit and reviewed my notes 50 times. Logan Hood started his cross-examination by asking if I had any training in child psychology. I said no. He asked if I'd ever made a false report before. Hua objected, and the judge sustained it. Hood tried asking the same question 5 different ways until the judge told him to move on. Hood shuffled his papers and asked about my training in recognizing abuse patterns. I listed my continuing education courses while Marina sat in the gallery watching me. Her hands gripped the bench so tight her knuckles went white. She kept staring at me like she was seeing me for the first time. The prosecutor objected to Hood's next question about whether I'd ever misdiagnosed anything. The judge sustained it again. Hood's face got red and he slammed his folder on the table. The judge warned him about his behavior. Marina leaned forward when I described finding the bruises on Isabella's arms. Her face crumpled and she covered her mouth with both hands. A woman next to her patted her shoulder. Hood tried to make it sound like normal childhood marks, but I stayed calm and explained the specific patterns that matched adult grip marks. Marina was crying now but trying to be quiet about it. When I finished testifying and walked past the gallery, Marina mouthed the words, "Thank you," to me. Her eyes were puffy and red. I nodded and kept walking. My legs felt like jelly, and I had to grab the railing going down the courthouse steps. Sierra was waiting in her car and jumped out when she saw me. She grabbed my arm and helped me to the passenger seat. My hands shook so bad I couldn't buckle my seatbelt. Sierra did it for me and drove me home without saying anything. She helped me inside and made me tea while I sat on my couch staring at nothing. The prosecutor called later and said I did great, but I felt empty and tired. 3 days later, Marina went to her first group therapy session at the Women's Center. She sat in a circle with 7 other women. The facilitator asked everyone to share one thing about their experience. When Marina's turn came, she said the word torture for the first time. She'd never called it that before, always just said things were hard or difficult. 2 other mothers nodded when she said it. One reached over and squeezed her hand. They all knew what that word really meant. Marina cried through the rest of the session but stayed until the end. That same week, I was doing a routine cleaning when my phone buzzed with a text from Detective Suarez. I excused myself and read that the father had shown up at Paul's school trying to get information about him. The school called police immediately, and they arrested him for violating the protection order. His bail got revoked and the judge ordered him held until trial. I went back to finish the cleaning, but my hands were steady this time. Knowing he was locked up made everything feel safer. Marina heard the news from her lawyer and felt relief mixed with panic. Part of her brain still expected him to come home. She caught herself setting the table for 4 people at the shelter. She still jumped when she heard car doors slam. During her next therapy session, she admitted something she hadn't told anyone. She'd been planning to take him back. Not consciously, but she'd been saving money in a separate envelope, researching apartments near the jail, even looking up visiting hours. Her therapist didn't judge, just asked what Marina wanted to do with that information. They spent the session making a safety plan for weak moments. Marina wrote down 10 reasons she couldn't go back and kept the list in her wallet. Meanwhile, I sat at my desk after work and pulled out a piece of paper. I wrote Isabella a letter I knew I'd never send. I promised her she'd have boring dinners where nobody had to be perfect. I told her she'd get normal bedtimes and could move whenever she wanted. I wrote that someday the statue game would just be a bad memory. I folded the letter and put it in my desk drawer with her drawing. 2 weeks later, Marina got approved to move from the shelter to transitional housing. It was a tiny 1-bedroom apartment, but it had windows that opened and no closet under the stairs. She walked through it 3 times, checking every door and corner. The property manager thought she was looking for damage, but Marina was just making sure there were no small dark spaces. She signed the lease and got her keys. On moving day, she only had 2 boxes and a garbage bag of clothes, but it felt like freedom. She found the kitchen timer in one of the boxes and held it for a long time. Then she walked to the Goodwill donation bin down the street and dropped it in. She heard it hit the bottom with a small thud. Back at the clinic, Katarzyna called me into her office. The dental board had opened an investigation after Hood filed a complaint about my unprofessional conduct. He claimed I'd overstepped my boundaries and violated patient confidentiality. Katarzyna said not to worry because she'd already sent them all our documentation showing I'd followed every protocol perfectly. I welcomed their review and gave them copies of everything. I knew I'd done the right thing. Marina met with prosecutor Juan Guyon the next week to discuss a plea deal. The father would serve 5 years in prison, register as an offender, and have no contact with the family for 15 years. Marina wouldn't have to testify, and more importantly, neither would the kids. She agreed immediately. Nguyen explained he'd still have to formally accept it in court, but she expected him to take it. Marina signed the paperwork with a steady hand. When I heard about the potential plea deal, part of me felt disappointed. After everything, it seemed like there should be more of a fight, more drama, some big courtroom showdown. But Jasmine reminded me during a follow-up call that the goal was never about winning some legal battle. It was about protecting Isabella and Paul. She was right, and I knew it, but it still felt weird to have it potentially end with paperwork instead of a verdict. 3 days later, Marina called me through Jasmine to thank me for saving her kids. Her voice cracked when she told me she'd been trying to record her victim impact statement for the judge, but kept breaking down every time she got to the part about Paul hitting his head against the wall. She'd sit in front of her phone with the voice recorder app open and start talking about what their father took from them. She'd get maybe 2 minutes in before the crying would start, and she'd have to delete it and try again. On her 6th try, she made it all the way through by focusing on one word at a time, instead of thinking about the meaning. She wanted the judge to understand that this wasn't just hitting or yelling, but something way worse that stole her children's ability to feel safe anywhere. Meanwhile, the dental board sent their decision letter clearing me of any wrongdoing in the case. They actually praised my documentation and said I'd followed every protocol perfectly, which made me feel better about the whole thing. Katarzyna made copies of the letter and framed one for the break room where everyone could see it. She said it was important for the whole team to know they'd done the right thing by supporting me that day. The next week, Marina met with Jasmine about getting her kids back eventually. CPS laid out this huge list of requirements, including therapy twice a week and parenting classes every Saturday morning. Marina would need random home visits where they'd check everything from her fridge contents to whether she had working smoke detectors. The supervised visits would start at 2 hours once a week and slowly increase if everything went well. Marina signed every paper they put in front of her without even reading the fine print. She told Jasmine she'd do whatever it took, even if it meant jumping through hoops for years. Back at the clinic, our new security system became just part of the routine after a few weeks. We had these fancy key cards now that tracked who entered which areas and when. Sierra joked that we were like a spy movie with all the protocols, but really we all felt safer knowing nobody could just walk in anymore. The buzzer system for the front door meant we could see who was coming before letting them in. During one of Marina's supervised visits at the CPS office, something amazing happened. Paul actually laughed at a joke Isabella told about their foster family's dog who liked to steal socks. Marina told me later it was the first time she'd heard him laugh in over a year. The supervisor smiled and wrote something in her notebook that looked positive based on her expression. Marina spent the rest of the visit just trying to make him laugh again by doing silly voices when she read them a story. I spent an afternoon putting together complete dental records for both kids to send to their new dentist near the foster home. I included every x-ray and note from their visits, plus a letter explaining they might be scared of dental work because of what happened. I wrote that they'd learned to hide pain really well, so the dentist should watch for subtle signs of discomfort. I made copies for the prosecutor too, since she said medical records helped show the pattern of neglect. 2 weeks before the plea hearing, Marina practiced reading her statement with her therapist over and over. At the actual hearing, she stood at the podium while her ex sat at the defense table staring at his hands. She read about how the kids used to be happy and loud before the game started. She talked about watching them learn to move without making sound and eat without dropping anything. The judge listened to every word while taking notes. When she finished, the judge looked at the father and asked if he was accepted the plea agreement. He just nodded without looking up. The judge sentenced him to 5 years in state prison with supervised probation after release. He'd lose parental rights permanently and couldn't have unsupervised contact with any minors, including his own kids. The restraining order would last 15 years, which meant Isabella would be 23 and Paul would be 21 before he could legally contact them. Hua invited me to attend the sentencing since my testimony had been so important to the case. I sat in the back row of the courtroom watching everything unfold. Justice felt smaller than I expected, like it couldn't really fix what happened. But it was still necessary to have consequences and boundaries and official recognition that what he did was wrong. Marina had to leave the courtroom to throw up after hearing the sentence, even though she knew it was coming. When she came back, she looked different somehow, like she was standing up straighter. Watching her read that statement, I could see strength that wasn't there 10 weeks ago when this all started. She'd gone from someone who enforced the statue game to someone fighting to protect her kids. The system had worked even if it wasn't perfect or fast or able to undo the damage. Marina told me later that knowing her kids would be adults before he could contact them felt like she could finally breathe. She'd been so scared he'd get out and come after them or manipulate them into coming back. Now there were legal papers saying he couldn't do that, backed up by the threat of more prison time if he tried. Marina stood at the next family court hearing 3 weeks later while the judge reviewed her compliance reports from CPS. She'd completed 40 hours of parenting classes and hadn't missed a single therapy session in 2 months. The judge signed the order approving overnight visits starting the following month. Marina had already spent her first 3 paychecks from the grocery store painting the kids' room at her transitional housing apartment and buying nightlights shaped like stars. She'd even gotten Paul a weighted blanket because her therapist said it might help with his nightmares. A thick envelope arrived at my office through CPS the next week with Isabella's name written on the return address in careful crayon letters. Inside was a drawing of herself sitting in a dental chair with the biggest smile I'd ever seen her draw, surrounded by hearts and rainbows. I filed it in my locked drawer with all the other case documents, not ready to hang it up where patients might ask questions. Marina's first overnight visit happened on a Friday and turned into complete chaos within 2 hours. Paul woke up screaming 4 times, and Isabella kept testing every single boundary, asking if she could eat cookies for dinner and stay up past midnight. Marina made scrambled eggs at 6 in the morning while both kids sat at the table without anyone having to freeze or play any games. She told her therapist later that just eating breakfast together felt like winning the lottery. The county asked me to join a panel training other mandated reporters about recognizing abuse signs, and I spent 3 hours walking them through everything I'd documented. My voice stayed steady when I showed them the photos of Isabella's bruises and explained how kids normalize abuse through games and competitions. Nobody in that room would miss those signs again. 4 months after the arrest, Marina called my office asking if she could bring Isabella in for her regular cleaning. We scheduled it for a Tuesday afternoon, and when they walked in, Marina looked me straight in the eyes and mouthed, "Thank you," while Isabella ran ahead to the toy box. The whole appointment felt weird but good, with Marina reading magazines in the lobby like any other parent while Isabella chatted about her new teacher and the class hamster named Mr. Whiskers. I locked up the clinic after a completely normal Thursday of cleanings and fillings and realized I hadn't thought about Isabella's father in over a week. My hands didn't shake anymore when cars pulled into our parking lot, and I'd stopped checking my mirrors constantly on the drive home. The healing wasn't done, but it was happening. Marina signed a lease for a 2-bedroom apartment using money she'd saved from 4 months of grocery store night shifts. The kids would share a room with bunk beds she found at a thrift store, but the place had its own entrance and no closet under any stairs. She hung Isabella's drawings on every wall and bought Paul a reading light so he could look at picture books when he couldn't sleep. 6 months after that first appointment, Isabella sat in my chair for her routine cleaning, talking nonstop about her new school's science fair, where she'd grown beans in different types of soil. Marina sat in the lobby reading an actual magazine instead of watching the door, looking like any regular parent waiting for their kid. When Isabella opened wide without any fear or hesitation, showing healthy teeth and gums with no new injuries anywhere, I knew we'd all made it through something terrible and come out different, but okay, on the other side. Well, folks, that's all for today. Thanks for sticking around while I asked all my questions and wondered about things. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.